My fellow gender abolitionists, cool people, and anime fans, I am happy to report that once again, anime has been saved. Every staffer, new and old, working on this show is under my notice for the rest of time, just on the strength of what I saw here today. Seems like once a year we get a new show that kind of benchmarks the current innovations in action animation, like last year's second season of Jujutsu Kaisen and third season of Mob Psycho 100. And this year we've got the jaw-dropping opener of DANDADAN, which I'll be blown away to see topped over the course of the first season's run. Rarely do I feel that an already excellent manga series is enhanced by its adaptation into animation, but I'm having a hard time thinking that this anime isn't just a linear improvement over the manga experience. Two things in particular brought an extra layer of emotionality to it that the manga didn't have, which pulled me into the story a lot more than I had been drawn into the first chapter of the manga, which I did also give a positive review to over on my Manga Monday show earlier this year. First of those enhancements is the voice performances of Hanai Natsuki-san playing Ken and Wakayama Shion-san playing Momo. Hanai-san has already proven his capacity to carry a shonen action serial, having played Tanjiro from Demon Slayer, and so it won't surprise fans of that series to hear that he captures youthful intensity with masterful energy. Although being that he's like a nerd in this show, he also is pretty different from Tanjiro. I legitimately wasn't sure if the actor was a man or a woman for most of the episode until that last scene when the character is deliberately trying to sound manly and just so barely does, leading to perfect comedy when Momo eggs him on, saying, "Show him how manly you are," then the alien just trounces him instantly. But really, the moment that had sold me on the improvements brought to the story by his voice was the pretend vomiting noise that he makes after being told just how haunted the tunnel is, followed by singing about being a shy boy in shaky English, then being reminded to quiet down, and singing the same thing in an even funnier, quieter voice. Wakayama Shion-san playing Momo displays a robust range of emotion very convincingly, and even at the end puts on a whole other voice for her child scenes that I had thought might be just a whole different actress for a second. Somehow I have never heard Wakayama-san in any leading roles before, personally. Her bit parts in shows that I have seen were so minor that I can't remember them, but I am a big fan of what she's doing in this series. The other incredible strength of this show is the timing of its animation, which almost always ought to be integral to the appeal of animation, but it's a lot harder to get it with the level of consistency seen in this series from almost any other manga adaptation, especially considering how much the pacing of manga adaptations tends to be affected by the organization of information from the source material. DANDADAN thankfully doesn't make the usual mistake of just adapting the animation storyboards directly from the manga, and instead it frees up the proverbial camera so that the same scenes can be tackled from different angles and with a different sense of pacing, while still incorporating the most iconic and easily translatable images from the source material into the animation. You're going to hear everyone clamor about the incredible action scene from this episode's climax, including me in just a moment. But the part that I thought the anime improved on the most was Momo and Ken meeting for the first time. My expectations for the less mysterious and action-heavy scenes hadn't been as high based on glimpses that I'd gotten from the trailer, but the tone of this scene managed by its direction and animation is incredibly particular, and it actually takes you for kind of an emotional ride, instead of just hanging in a single emotional space in the way that a lot of scenes set in school in anime have a tendency to do. Rather than describing everything that happens, I'm going to compare a few specific cuts of animation to the original panels of the manga so that we can see how the staff injected so much extra personality into the original images. Right from the jump, the most obvious addition to the source material is a sense of space, especially in the opening scene, which in the manga almost doesn't feel like it takes place in any particular location until you see what looks like the side of a generic manga high school in the very last panel of the scene. Whereas the manga is in a rush to establish Momo as the protagonist and showing her personality through this first full spread, the anime just zooms in on her expression, knowing that the voice acting will add enough to make her understated pose less necessary, and it opens them up to this interesting take on the next panel. The manga had just shown a guy that she's talking to who grabs a hold of his belt while he's creeping on her. In the anime, we start from behind this guy's head, and we watch him circle around her like a shark, never really looking at her and slinking in this exaggerated gait, all conveying like a shit-eating Yakuza personality that's even more hateable than the unmemorable way that he's presented in the manga, notwithstanding the dialogue. Just look at how Nicholas Light reacted to the presentation of this character immediately.
That's definitely a bully. He has that Connie cut. Yep, you don't have that Buzz Connie cut from Attack on Titan unless you're an asshole.
Even him grabbing his belt hits way harder when you add in that little animation of him tugging up, emphasizing his crotch. By comparison, the manga seems like it's only interested in this scene for what it establishes about the characters conceptually, whereas the anime does a much better job of actually creating a scene that's fun to watch in and of itself. Lots of connective tissue is used to keep us feeling inside of that scene, whereas the manga just shows Momo's shoe at the end of the first page and then her dramatic attempting to kick the guy in the head at the top of the second page, followed by in the next panel him already having caught her next attempt at a punch. The anime gives way more impact to that kick, thanks to the setup of Momo dropping her bag and twisting her ankles, the whipping sound of the bag hitting the ground also creating a tension whip pull, which is cracked at the end of the huge swing into the impact of the kick. Both the anime and manga use similarly exaggerated perspective to sell the impact of this shot, but the anime also corrects the angle of Momo's arm and pushes the guy further back, de-emphasizing his surprised expression so they can better convey the spacing between the two combatants. If you look closely, the impact of Momo's leg against his hand is so intense that it actually sends a shockwave of air through his lips so that you can see him gritting his teeth. And just in case that expression was too vague, the camera then pulls in so we can see him up close, and he shoves her leg away in time to catch an approaching punch. We see all of that, so it doesn't feel like just disconnected images jumping through time. Both versions of the scene end the encounter with the guy kicking Momo in the gut, but the anime has her being sent flying into the foreground, which is a visual language I really like when it comes to heroes getting injured, because it feels like that pain is approaching us in the audience physically, like it's coming towards us. I'm not the only one who's loving the way the animation adds depth to the character moments. I recommend this video by Rauro, who listed a bunch of great little moments in their video about this episode, and also convinced me that the English dub for this show is at least marginally as good as the Japanese one. This video made me realize I cannot comprehensively cover every enhancement, but here's a few that Rauro mentioned.
Momo's tearful venting, the way she drags her feet as she sulks through the halls, how she rolls her eyes before dropping her bag.
Something could be said about every single one of these little bits of animation, or even voice flourishes, like how much more it hits in voice form when Momo's two friends both say, "Guys like that are extinct," at the same time, but there's only a few that I cannot go without commenting on. Those shots of Momo's legs when she's dragging herself down the halls are so perfect that I could not believe there wasn't really an equivalent shot in the manga. Hopefully I wasn't the only person who immediately thought about K-On! When I saw these shots, especially considering that K-On! Director Yamada Naoko-san directed her most recent cult classic Heike Monogatari at Studio Science Saru just a couple of years ago. Yamada-san has talked in interviews about how a girl's soul can be seen in the way that she moves her legs, and I'd say that that applies with Ayase-san here perfectly. Every single reaction video I watched while I was writing this commented about how great that shot of the legs was, by the way. Here's Chris Killens to start.
The way she's dragging her feet, no.
Bro, this perspective, we're right back at it. Walking like Ghetto.
Her character design is dope, by the way. I really love her character design.
In your boy Roshi's reaction, the commentators keep expressing how impressed they are with Momo's character design, which I think is a testament most especially to that design's versatility. Creating designs that are capable of morphing in so many ways without losing their sense of particular personality and realism is so hard that it might as well be what separates great cartoon characters from unmemorable ones. I think this show ought to be considered a masterclass of character design and animation direction, and it is the reason that you need to know the name Naoyuki Onda from now on. Quick history lesson. Naoyuki Onda has been a badass character designer since the late 1980s. The oldest work I know from him is 1990 OVA Sol Bianca, which was aesthetically ahead of its time as a show about a bunch of cool butch tomboys piloting spaceships to save women all over the galaxy, which I think could easily be reimagined into something that would hit at least with my Twitter oomfies today. 1919 from 1990 is heavily experimental in what it does to its designs, and so is Detective Story from the Animatrix, which now Yuki-san would direct for in 2003, jumping ahead a bit. Ergo Proxy also came out that year, an anime with such strong character designs that I remember buying the art box with the first DVD just on the strength of Riel's look alone, having mistaken the show for being designed by Yoshitoshi Abe, who was my favorite at the time. Now Yuki-san would also act as assistant character designer and chief animation director on Psycho Pass, eventually taking over the role of lead designer on later seasons, and he also filled those roles for one of the best-looking animation showcases of the last decade, Shingeki no Bahamut Virgin Soul. As amazing as Naoyuki-san's work has always been, DANDADAN feels like a step up and a clear statement about where to take animation, almost like a new school of thought as compared to other dominant styles in action animation over recent years. Most fascinating to me about the animation in this show is how often it goes for something kind of slow and fluid in its own limited way, and is openly weird without being weird just for the sake of it. Maybe it'll be easier to describe what's unique about it by comparing it to other animation styles I'm more used to. Yoshinori Kaneda-san was one of the most influential animators of all time, especially in how he was the biggest influence on one of the best known Japanese animators in the world today, Imaishi Hiroyuki-san. Both of them are known for their exaggerated limited animation that I can best describe as kind of sharp, pointy, jumpy, and bouncy between extremes. This style has hugely impacted Western animation this decade, with movies like the Spider-Verse films and Puss in Boots 2 showing obvious influence from Studio Trigger and Imaishi-san's signature style. Imaishi-san's style is built around milking the most action and emotion that you can out of the fewest possible frames. Animation at its core is created by managing the timing of drawings, knowing what it will feel like for the images to move with a certain timing. But because so much of animation is really militantly crafted around doing whatever takes the least work to achieve, making something great often has less to do with getting the chance to put in as much effort as possible, and more to do with how do you best maximize the impact of the efforts you can make. The tendency then is to think, okay, let's draw the most insane thing possible with the few frames we've got. Everything stays moving as fast and as warped and as manic as it could be without losing the sense of grounding in weight that makes it so satisfying to see animated action. Perhaps the single most influential Japanese animator alive today, Nakamura Yutaka-san, pushed the creation of impact in action animation so far that he ended up making a technique we literally just call impact frames, in which the entire art style of the series temporarily warps under the pressure of a blow's impact. DANDADAN doesn't take those approaches. Instead, it comes from a school of another tremendously influential animator, former Science Saru's studio head, Yuasa Masaaki-san. The best way I can describe Yuasa-san's animation is as a blobby. He's got the blobbiest animation in the world, to the point that he kind of got obsessed with animating water for a while when the studio first formed. DANDADAN director Yamashiro Fuga-san, who's actually making his full directorial debut with this series, is deeply dyed in Yuasa-san's directorial influence, having served as an assistant production manager on the studio's earliest works, including The Night is Short, Walk On Girl, and Devilman Crybaby, and then graduated to an assistant director on Ride Your Wave, episode director for Keep Your Hands Off the Eizouken, and the aforementioned Heike Monogatari from director Yamada Naoko-san. I couldn't imagine a better pair of directorial influences to have come up through than Yuasa Masaaki-san and Yamada Naoko-san, and I'm happy to report that Yamashiro-san's work on this series so far rises to the level of either mentor's directorial work. Now, I can praise the animation for its subtle characterization and impeccable tone setting all day, but it only matters because it all leads up to sincerely emotional moments. My favorite moment in the first half of this episode is when Momo snaps at Ken for shoving his autistic fixations in her face and then feels bad about it and returns to apologize. I had not remembered this moment from the manga at all, and I realized why when I went back to look at it. The interaction happens so quickly that it doesn't even really convey the feeling of Momo leaving leaving the scene and re-entering it, like what happens in the anime. So let's examine what they did to turn what feels like almost a throwaway moment in the manga into the turning point that sold me on Momo's character forever in the anime. We'll start with the setup. Both anime and manga open with the ending of Momo's first toxic relationship. It's easy for us to be on Momo's side through this because we're following her perspective, she's cool, and the guy seems like a stupid douchebag. But ultimately their relationship was founded on the worst stereotypical dating habits of both men and women. The wanksta boy is just worried about getting laid and getting paid, and Momo chases after guys that look like Takakura Ken. Now, I don't know shit about actor Takakura Ken-san, who was massively successful in Japan until his death at 85 in 2014, but the fact that he played Golgo 13 in the 1973 Golgo 13 live-action movie, I think tells me everything I could possibly need to know. Momo, having failed to enact violent retribution for the bozo's insult to her chastity, slinks around the school looking for release. But her friends clearly think that she needs to get over her weird fixation on Takakura Ken and date a guy for his personality, and so they will not let her trauma dump on them. Momo gets so heated that she wanders around the school literally looking for a fight, and so she tries to insert herself between a bully and his aggressors, only to be disappointed when they cower away from her. Ken is so impressed with this girl that he musters up the courage to go try and talk to her, but the only thing he understands is paranormal alien phenomena as per his beloved magazine, so he just kinda spurgs out about it at her. From Momo's perspective, Ken is basically putting himself in her line of fire without realizing it, just trying to be friendly, and maybe Ken would have been better off waiting a little bit, but we'll understand his desperation when he explains himself later. In the manga, Ken seems just a little bit put back and sad about the way Momo tells him off, which itself feels a little bit more plainly comedic, only containing a pang of sadness when she tells him that he's got no friends, and then apologizes a few panels later. In the anime, you feel the fear shooting through Ken when Momo looms over him, and her words are even more cutting, telling him, how you push stuff at me is so typical of otaku and really annoying. On the cue of the word annoying, the camera pans out to reveal how this comedically scary image of Momo is being reflected in Ken's glasses, giving this sense almost like he's being flashbulb traumatized by this interaction. The way the camera pulls away from him with the same rhythm of her words, "Dakara tomodachi inen da yo," is like she's shoving him out of her world with her words, even though she should still be standing right in front of him. But by the time the zine drops from his hands, we realize that he's just been staring blankly ahead as she left that space, and is heading into the foreground of the frame, regressing towards the isolation where the audience sits. Momo literally walks all the way past the frame, but then the proverbial camera pulls back, revealing that she actually stopped in her tracks a few steps further down. She turns around, and now it's like she's standing next to us as we both look back on the kid that she didn't mean to hurt to see how he's doing. Then we get this incredible shot of the two of them separated by the hallway, when Momo stops on the first stair and returns to apologize. In the manga, Momo was just heading to the right and then turned back to the left. It never felt like she was really going anywhere, as opposed to the anime not only taking her all the way out of the scene momentarily, but also showing that she was on her way up a set of stairs before she decided to re-enter Ken's moment. I think the huge door in the middle of the frame was also a great way to subtly create more visual division between them, and it's also the kind of detail that's usually skipped in school anime. The really guilty way that Momo sulks back into the scene and slowly dusts off the book lets me sit inside of her head through this interaction in a way that didn't resonate with me when I was reading the source material. Maybe this hadn't struck me in the same way because the manga so clearly regards Momo as a badass, or maybe because I like her so much, but in the anime I quickly realized that Momo has serious anger issues. She responds to insults with violence. She actively puts herself in hostile situations hoping for a fight, and she loses her temper saying the meanest thing that she can think of to someone that annoyed her just a little bit while she was in a bad mood. Speaking personally as a 33-year-old who recently caught a week-long Twitter ban for telling someone to kill themselves after they insulted me, I can relate. I also know what it's like to say something incredibly mean, immediately regret it, and want to make it right before leaving the scene, because I know I won't be able to stop feeling bad about the state that I've left a person in afterwards if I think I hurt them when they didn't really deserve it. Watching that mental process happen in real time in a way that felt just like the rhythm of going through it in real time is what sucked me into her character and into the overall experience of the story more than I had gotten when I was reading it the first time. Oh, and by the way, the prestige of this whole scene is when Momo extends the olive branch that she actually believes in ghosts, and Ken laughs at her, saying there's no such thing as ghosts, and the tone of the scene completely inverts into uproarious romantic comedy as they argue about the reasons that each of their paranormal speculations are true, only to be identified from afar as an obscure form of flirting by Momo's friends immediately, who approve of this relationship based on her personality. When I read this chapter of DANDADAN, I remember feeling like the story had only really started when we got to the tunnel. Possibly because there's just so little background art before that point. This is the first time it felt like the author really cared about where the scene was taking place. Rather than contrasting sparsity with the intensity of detail, the anime can do so much more with color and light that it just as easily converts to the Scooby-Doo style cartoon mystery horror of these coming scenes. Nicholas Light, in his reaction, also clocked how the light behind Ken in this scene must be the spaceship from later on, and not the moon. Maybe my favorite cut in this scene is just that little moment when Ken's flashlight is moving to the rhythm of his dialogue, creating kind of like a joke that still enhances the creepy tone of the scene thanks to how frantic the light movement is. Momo's little backstory cutaway is another part that I think bears a lot of K-On! Influence, and is another bit that hit me a lot harder in the anime thanks to fleshing out the details of the scene instead of leaving it almost deliberately vague, which the manga seemingly did just to make it feel more like a memory, and the anime doesn't have to do that because it can use color design to convey that same feeling. This was another bit that got to me emotionally because of how I could connect with Momo's perspective. Growing up, my mom had a lot of outside opinions that other kids didn't like hearing me repeat, and while I was upset that I didn't fit in because of my perspective, I also believed that my mom was more correct than those kids, and their parents who had taught them differently from me. And so I grew to be very defensive about my beliefs because I saw them as a reflection of my mom's correctness. When Ken deflects Momo's question about why he believes in aliens, it's probably setting us up for a later reveal, but it also made me reflect on the bit before that where he had pointed out how he possibly could have been abducted by aliens at some point but had his memory wiped. I'm going to take a little detour to explain how I also connect with what I think is going on with this aspect of Ken's personality. My favorite album of all time is called Francis the Mute by the Mars Volta. It's a trippy, freaky, prog rock, jazz, salsa concept album about a guy investigating the mystery behind his birth. And while he's encircling ideas of what could have happened to him based on endless research, he never quite comes to an understanding of how he was brought into this world and what made him the way that he is. No, there's no light in the darkest of your furthest reaches, he is teased in the lyrics. Speaking personally, I've always felt like I'm sort of dragging a leg that's stuck in the past somewhere, but I can't figure out why or what started it or where it's stuck. Sometimes I find myself interrogating my history, desperately trying to acknowledge something that only ever ends up understood in a vague feeling and can never be pinned on an origin point. When Ken asks Momo, "Do you need to have a reason to like something?" my temptation is to say that there must be a reason, even if you can't figure out what that reason is for yourself because you don't have enough perspective. But that doesn't mean that you need to know that reason to keep experiencing the feeling, or that you need to justify why you feel that way to others to qualify for the experience of the feeling. And so I get feeling like I don't know how to justify this to you in a way that would mean something to you. I only know that this is what I like. I don't think I need to go into special detail about what's so good about the scene of Turbo Granny showing up. Everybody pretty much has the exact same reaction. And with that, we've more or less exited the subtle part of this episode's story and gotten into the part where it really starts beating you over the head with its thematic point. So let's finally talk about what actually makes DANDADAN so good at the very heart of the matter, which, of course, as always, is powerful adherence to its core themes. DANDADAN is a story about sexual sexual paradox, in particular about the way that sex simultaneously drives our desire toward coupling, but it also gets in the way of romance more than anything else. It's a show about the conquest of love over the alienating biological frequencies that command our emotions from the root. In this first episode, the main conflict which compels the action is the inability of these deuteragonists to trust one another implicitly based on what seem to be incongruencies in their core beliefs. Momo doesn't believe in aliens, Ken doesn't believe in ghosts, and in Momo's effort to convince Ken of the existence of ghosts, they both end up encountering and being traumatized by absolute proof of the other person's beliefs, with Ken being possessed by a perverted evil spirit and Momo being sexually assaulted by aliens. Spirits and aliens might be real or not depending on what you believe, but since the anime can't prove that either of those things exist in reality, let's talk about what this conflict metaphorically represents based on the real-life traumas that are being played into by these fictional creatures. Turbo Granny is such an instantly memorable monster, not just because of her amazing design, but also her glizzy gobbling tendencies.
Yeah, glizzy gobbler, bro. This motherfucker. King Saw said glizzy gobbler, bro. This is crazy. I've taken his banana.
If any type of character showed up in a dark tunnel and told the main character they wanted to suck his dick, it would probably evoke a shocked reaction from the audience, but the underlying emotion behind that shock might be incredibly different if, say, an attractive young person had shown up, instead of a woman that seems to be so old she's aged into monsterdom. Also, shout out to everybody who recognized Turbo Granny's voice right away, which adds another layer of humor to this that I hadn't even realized. Men are often stereotyped as just harboring this perpetual sexual thirst and a willingness to stick their dick in anything interested, which just simply isn't at all realistic. Actually, most guys probably don't want to fuck that many women that they see in the average day. And they certainly don't want to be come on to by someone that they find unattractive or even actively repulsive. Women who get used to their attention being sought after by men, they sometimes develop a flirtatious tendency that they don't simply shake just because they get older and that attention isn't being desired by as many men. In fact, it kind of becomes necessary to be even more aggressive with your advances if people aren't as innately interested in you based on your looks, to which plenty of ugly, rapey billionaires could surely attest. Older women have a certain hold on young men too, in that young men are usually raised with a strong moral imperative towards aiding, protecting, and respecting older women, and they will often recognize their authority as a matter of course. All of that is a long-winded way of saying that old ladies perv on young men something fierce sometimes, in a way that women very often complain about getting from older men, but men will rarely say anything about getting from older women because complaining about unwanted sexual advances and insulting an old woman's dignity are considered deeply unmanly traits in most world cultures. And while I say that women are more likely to speak up about their problems with older men, that doesn't mean that they are more likely to be believed or had those issues acknowledged. Jez Prada tells a great anecdote in her reaction to the episode, which I recommend checking out, about the way that guys tend to react to being turned down in their advances, for instance.
I'm sorry, but rejecting sometimes it can be dangerous because even though you are nice and you are doing it in a polite way, they take it so wrong and such like a personal attack on themselves, and it's just like, no, you're just not my type, or I'm engaged, or I'm with someone, and they are just nasty.
Every time a guy who doesn't act like a total douchebag with regards to sex decides that it must not be that big of a deal what women are going through, they forget how each one of those asshole guys is going around trying to fuck every single woman that they come across, meaning that practically every woman is guaranteed to have experiences with as many of these guys as are around them. Besides the dickhead boyfriend, the Serpoians also represent the threat of men who insist that they're good guys while acting the worst. "We're nice guys," they introduce themselves, to which Momo retorts, "Nice guys don't strip girls naked." And then she's told that her belongings were properly cared for as the alien indicates towards them in tatters on the ground. Do these Serpoians even comprehend the reasons that Momo is uncomfortable? Do they know she's uncomfortable? Are they really capable of listening? Or do they just not care? Ignoring her entirely, they just keep mansplaining about their male-only race wishing to learn about human reproduction by having sex with her, which they just announced they're going to do while whipping out robot dick probes and telling her that they're going to remove her uterus and banana that they, I guess, think she has for research. When she protests, they simply decide to use hypnosis to control her brain waves and make her horny, and the spiked end of the robot's dick reveals that whatever sex means to them is not going to be physically safe for Momo. All of this, between the Turbo Granny, the aliens, all of these are commonplace scenarios of sexual horror, just barely brought down from being truly horrific to a palatable place for teen manga by way of wacky artwork, fun use of lovable genre tropes, and hot-blooded shonen personality. These scenes represent scenarios that men and women have a hard time acknowledging the level on which the other gender deals with those issues, because those experiences are so much less common to members of the other gender, at least in the specifics of how those problems manifest. Basically, though, that problem is insistence without listening. These creatures have a desire for the person's sex which ignores the desire of the person with regards to sex. Momo is protecting her chastity for the sake of someone that she loves, and Ken is already in love with her and dedicated to her in his heart. Neither one of them is interested in their sexual pursuance, and so they team up to fight them all off. This begins with recognizing and acknowledging one another's truths, which is a lot easier for both of them because the little bit of time that they have spent together hasn't only revealed the truth of their realities to one another, but also the depth of those realities to themselves. What with Momo's belief in her grandmother's spirituality finally being justified, and Ken frustratedly getting the response from aliens he's always been signaling for, only to get the wrong kind of attention. Keep in mind, though, that Ken would have happily gotten probed by those aliens if he had been caught by himself, but it's only because these aliens are trying to bully the girl who protected him from bullies that he realizes his love for her takes priority even over his love for aliens, and it drives him to man up and get stomped. There's so much to love in this first episode, I could spend all day listing it all. From Creepy Nuts managing to make the best opening of the year all over again, I'm sure you remember Mashal Season 2, to the tunnel getting longer and the Turbo Granny introduction scene, or the alien getting blasted out the side of the spaceship, which crashes through a building into a cliffside and finally explodes with the reveal of Ken's name being the same as Takakura Ken, but I think you get why all that stuff rules. The last thing I want to touch on is just a few moments during that climactic fight, which had sold me on the show's animation when I saw it for the first time in a GIF on Twitter before watching the episode. Turbo Granny's fight scenes in the early chapters of the manga were the first thing that had really grabbed me when I was reading DANDADAN because of how insanely kinetic the movement feels across the pages of those fights. Turbo Granny feels as fast as the name implies thanks to frames like this one, in which the whole background and most of her body is a blur of speed lines, and we can see 3 attacks that she's just dodged in a row all in the same panel, creating the sense that this all happened inside of a single second. The anime could not have copied this methodology because it necessarily places images in sequence across a select interval of time, and lingering on a still image would convey that time had stopped, rather than that it was moving at extreme speed. Simply enough, they animated the granny moving very quickly and dodging several attacks. But the methodology for communicating her speed is almost the opposite of the manga throughout this whole scene. Rather than skipping ahead in time to the extremes of the movement, instead, the interpolation of frame speed creates a feeling as though our perspective on time keeps slowing down to show us what's happening, rather than delivering the action to us in real time. This effect is accomplished using warped perspective and shifting between fluid and jerky movements on opportune frames. You can kind of see the animation theory being explored just by that second shot in the episode of the guy circling Momo, when he jumps from being in front of her to behind her in like a couple of frames, but the image feels coherent because of the fluidity of his movement right before and after crossing the threshold of her place in the frame. This technique is on display most impressively to me in the shot when Granny gets her teeth in this alien's crotch and bends over backwards to suplex it, then continues bending on through her own legs to crawl towards the next enemy. There's a break in visual logic just for that one frame when we can't really explain how she got from one position to another, but everything around that feels so right that we aren't really pulled out of the action by that incongruency. And this is how the episode is all over the place. Anyways, if you want to learn a lot more about the actual philosophy behind the animation and the adaptation in general, I highly recommend reading Sakuga Blog's deep dive into the show's staff and their collation of interview statements about the show to date. I think this episode represents an absolute masterclass in adapting manga to animation, and I seriously hope that other anime studios take notes about what the team at Science Saru is doing here, especially because this is inevitably going to be the next big thing in anime for the rest of the season, and into what I'm sure will be the announcement of another season eventually, considering the huge length of the popular manga. Tell me what you thought of this first episode and about everything that I pointed out in this analysis down in the comments below, and remind me when the next episode comes out if you think I need to talk about that one as well. Thanks again to all the reaction channels I checked in with to be sure I didn't miss anything, whose videos are linked in the description, along with my link tree, which leads you to everything I've ever made online. If you like these kinds of extreme deep dives into animation, I highly recommend checking out my 80-minute analysis of Perfect Blue, just in time for Satoshi Kon's birthday this month. And also look forward to my next video about the impact of Elfenlied, which is celebrating the 20th anniversary of its ending on the 17th. Special thanks to the patrons and Substack backers whose names are on screen, and thanks again for watching. I've been Trixie the Golden Witch reminding you to never forget, anime forever.